Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to Recall This Book, where we invite scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events. I'm John Plotz of Brandeis, and today we ask a set of questions that brilliant radical thinkers have been asking for decades, or perhaps for centuries. First, how might we, quote, respond to harm and violence beside relying on the criminal legal system to send people to prison, close quote. Second, how might we establish a realistic way to abolish that prison system? And third, how might we rediscover a fundamental human right, the right to comfort, as one basis of the case to be made against an imprisonment system that here in the United States has wrecked or sideswiped so many lives and continues to accumulate collateral damage? So that is a very small order of business. Unfortunately, we have 200 years. No, I'm sorry, we only have 45 minutes to cover it. And I'm joined today by a professor who spent, well, I'm going to hear how long, but at least the last decade, I'm going to say, working on this topic. And that is Anna Terwiel, assistant professor of political science at Trinity College in Hartford. Her work includes the co-directorship of the Prison Education Project there, and she is the author of many articles in such journals as Political Theory, Polity, Theory and Event, and New Political Science. And she's here today to explore with us her fantastic new book out from University of Minnesota Press, 2025, right? Is that, yeah, 2025?
December 25, yeah.
December 25, great, which is called, Merry Christmas, which is called Prison Abolition for Realists. So Anna, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Super. So generally, as listeners know, we like to invite our guests to basically set the terms for the conversation, to begin by presenting the intellectual origins of the book, its genesis moment, you might say, and also the key claims and interventions. So would you like to get us started in that way?
Yeah, that sounds good. It has been at least a decade of work on this book. And in a way, it started, or the origins go back to when I was a graduate student at Northwestern, just outside of Chicago. And intellectually speaking, the origins were my encounter with Foucault's work, Discipline and Punish, but also soon thereafter, his activism with the Prisons Information Group in the early 1970s, the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons. He co-founded this activist group in 71, and it existed for a number of years. And so I found myself really interested in his both intellectual or like theoretical and practical critiques of the prison, and his insights into how central prisons are to our society, even though we think of them as marginal institutions. And they are places where already marginalized people are routinely sent. But I think I was really drawn to the power of his analysis that showed important continuities between prisons and other institutions, and between imprisonment and kind of broader power dynamics in society. At the same time, when I was working on my dissertation, I also was connected to a group of scholars and artists and activists who offer poetry and humanities and arts classes at Stateville Prison, about an hour outside of the city of Chicago. This was the Prison and Neighborhood Arts and Education Project. I could say more about what I want, like what I think of as the book's interventions. So it's called Prison Abolition for Realists. And that title is to try to be really clear about one large claim I'm making, which is that abolitionism, like abolitionist thinking, is not a set of abstract fantasies, like some kind of wishful thinking disconnected from reality, but really a set of reflections on punishment and on our broader democracy that is very, very lucid, very attuned to how our society actually works in practice, and how punishment actually works in practice. And how it works in practice, as different abolitionists will tell you, is like, we're told that this is we're told that punishment, like, protects us from the bad guys, and that this makes our society safer. And generally what you see is that punishment and imprisonment inflict state violence on already marginalized groups who are, the most intensely targeted by the punishment system, while other forms of harm and lawbreaking are allowed to continue and are not, in fact, punished. And you might think about just the really widespread harm of sexual violence. I mean, I come at abolition also as a feminist. You can think about white collar crime. So we're told that punishment, keeps us safer. And in fact, when you look empirically at what happens, it tends to solidify already existing inequalities in society, while leaving while not addressing problems like poverty or deprivation or lack of access to healthcare.
Yeah, you have a nice line. Maybe I could quote it. I think it's an amplification of what you just said. But early on, you say prison abolition departs from both abstract normative theorizing and from realist tendencies to underestimate possibilities for positive change. So I understand you just gave us kind of the negative version there because you talked about the, the committed crimes that go unacknowledged or unpoliced. But that isn't the only thing you mean when you're talking about possibilities for positive change.
Like equal punishment for all? Yeah, no, right.
Yeah.
I mean, so many abolitionists, though not all, offer alternative visions of how we might respond to harm. So you get abolitionist accounts of restorative justice or transformative justice, like different mechanisms that center the question of repair, that center the question of prevention, and that try to involve the directly affected people directly into the resolution process or the justice process, rather than relying on state on professionals to sort out these issues for us. But I think importantly, most abolitionists don't just focus on alternative ways of responding to harm, but they offer visions of bigger social, economic, political change that would prevent a lot of harm that exists and that is done, and that would kind of just make society more just, more democratic, and less willing to warehouse or throw away entire groups of the population in the name of justice.
Okay, great. And I think I would love for us to land there. I mean, I think it's significant. I think your final chapter is the right to comfort,
Yep.
right? Is that, yeah. So I'd love to get to there. And also, I think I mentioned to you, I'm interested in this category of like non-reformist reform. Like, in other words, how does one work with, generally benevolent moderates who are trying to do something, and how do you align yourself with them without kind of just sinking back into the logic of the system? But maybe, since you're an academic and the point of academic work is to make these sharp distinctions, maybe you could talk about these different categories that you have proposed for making sense of different sorts of abolitionist thinking. So the terms you use are the paranoid, the purity politics, and then this agonistic. So do you want to sort of talk us through the pluses and minuses of the paranoid and the purity approach?
Yes. Because on the one hand, so one aim of the book is to say, most abolitionist thinking really belongs in the realist tradition, in that it is very attuned to empirical realities and thinks about practical interventions and how you can shift power dynamics. Another ambition of the book is to reveal and help us better understand the internal richness and diversity of abolitionist thinking. So, I mentioned I've in graduate school was very shaped by the work of Foucault, and then as I read more about abolition, I noticed that sometimes Foucault and Foucauldian abolitionism was just kind of assumed to be the same as, or very similar to, or simply very compatible with, say, the abolitionism of Angela Davis, and that struck me as just not right. There are theoretical distinctions between a Foucauldian approach to society and a Black feminist Marxist one, and I got the sense that these differences were not being seen like clearly enough or teased out and thought through. So yeah, what I do in the book is develop a kind of typology, not to say that any one thinker fits entirely into any one of these boxes, but like to try to help us distinguish between different styles or different modes of abolitionist thought and practice. Um, and the
Can I say I really appreciate that notion of the style or the mode? I mean, I don't know if we'll come back to that or not, but I mean, obviously, nothing is conceived in a vacuum. Everything has its historical moment, and things are produced in moments of despair or optimism. So I like the logic of style or mode, if I understand what you
right.
mean by it, is that you could have y- proposals that one ultimately might not want to get behind the proposal, but you can understand why it would have been engendered at a moment of, yeah,
Yeah, and
whatever.
also why like the thinker or the group or the movement that supports one proposal in one moment like might at a later
Yeah.
point in time, offer something different. Um yeah, so what I call like one concept I offer is that of abolitionism in a paranoid style or in a paranoid mode. And I work with Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's understanding of the term paranoid thinking. I'm not at all saying that like paranoid thinking is wrong or incorrect or to in any way pathologize it. But I find Sedgwick's reflection on paranoid thinking as a style of critique useful for identifying one kind of abolitionism. And I often use Foucault as an example actually of to illustrate what I mean. So abolitionism in a paranoid mode um, see like has a very big concept of the carceral. So
Hmm.
carcerality or carceral power, we're not just talking about prisons or even punitive institutions, but like this is a concept that can travel. And so Foucault sees this like carceral power in schools and in workplaces and in hospitals. And then abolitionism in this paranoid mode is very attuned to all the forms that carcerality can take, and very worried about inadvertently replicating it or supporting something that turns out to be that you thought was going to be different, like that you thought was going to be abolitionist, but that turned out to
Yeah.
be carceral. So it operates in a kind of mode where like it's very attuned to carcerality. It tries to expose it in places where we might not suspect it. So, had you considered that perhaps social workers could actually fulfill a similar policing function to the actual police, or like had you
Yeah.
considered
Yeah.
to think about the example of deinstitutionalization, that like you might close a large state hospital that warehouses and confines people with
Yeah.
disability labels, but that like they might find themselves in smaller group homes that could also actually be another kind of prison, like just like a variation of the
Yeah.
same. And
There was a punk rock band when I was I just remembered in the 1980s called The Creeping Corrosion of Conformity. And I got the point, but it is right. I mean, it's just like ultimately, if it's
right,
everywhere, then on some level it can be nowhere as well. And that's a problem.
right, and if you are primarily worried about or like really preoccupied with anticipating carcerality, then how can you move to offering to daring to offer an alternative, like
Mm.
so how and so I think in practice, um yeah, maybe like the carceral is everywhere but or nowhere, but like how like um Foucault never offers an alternative. I mean, famously, or
Mm.
famously or infamously,
Yeah.
right? So, or
Yeah.
in the prisons information group too, they were like,
Yeah.
prisons are intolerable. We're gonna try to bring to the public sphere like what incarcerated people say about them, as opposed to pundits and the Minister of Justice.
Yeah.
But we're not going to tell you what alternative, like, response to harm we would like to see, or like what kind of economic changes or redistribution we would
Right.
like to see to advance like a political project that we are for. So, yeah, my concern with abolitionism in a paranoid mode, it's like it has really great insights into the pervasiveness of carceral power. It has very good insights into the risks of any kind of do-gooder project that, like,
Yeah.
that, like, really you might actually end up, um, yeah, like reproducing some of the problems that you were trying to remedy. But it can lead to inaction. Like, it can demobilize people
Yeah.
because it is not clear how you could ever escape, the
I
carceral.
know.
And if it doesn't demobilize, then it can lead to a politics of purity, which is like, maybe we can rid ourselves of, the cop in our head, of carceral logics. Like, we
Yeah.
can kind of try to, yeah, like, really to become free of this bad thing.
Yeah.
But again, like, that's not the same as affirming like a shared vision, and then like trying to assemble a political coalition to realize it.
Yeah, I have a very dear friend who speaks about the nonprofit industrial complex, and I do understand what he means by saying it, but I worry about that, like that it pushes you to a space of purity where you just don't have any friction under your feet anymore. Your feet kind of slip out from under you because you don't have anyone to hold on to. So yeah. The purity, yeah, the way you diagnose, the way you characterize the extremity of purity is that it causes people to, quote, withdraw from political struggle to pursue changes inside the self. And incidentally, I studied the Chartists, mid-19th century political movement. The Chartists, that's what happened to them after they were politically defeated. They turned towards like moral reform. And that is, I get that. I mean, like it became a question of self-purification. But I hadn't quite understood. So you're actually, rather than purity and paranoia existing in opposite poles, you're seeing them more, they're diagnostically linked to one another.
Yeah,
That's
right. Yeah,
problem.
I see the
Yeah.
purity. I see the purity politics as one outgrowth, or like one response to a diagnosis of the problem that is overwhelming, um, and like without something that can pull us toward, a positive vision that we're willing to risk fighting for, even though it might, I don't know, it might backfire, it might disappoint. Like, it's going to have
Mm.
problems of its own. It won't be pure, um, but nonetheless, abolitionism, as I um, as I see it, has to contain both a radical critique, like a no to mass incarceration, like a no to the
Mhm.
warehousing and sacrifice, or like the throwing away of so many people and communities. But it also has to offer um, like concrete alternative proposals, like both in terms of how we're going to deal with harm, but also like bigger question, like just like what would a more just society look like, and what will we try to secure to
Yeah.
get there?
One word you use for that I found very suggestive, and I'd love to like invite you to talk to us about maybe tangible or particular, practical versions of this agonistic realist abolitionism you think. But you use the word remainders as something that like we might have to be content with remainders rather than purity, I guess.
Yeah, or I wouldn't say we have to be content with remainders, but we have to be reconciled to the reality that even the best, most radical, most democratic project is going to have remainders. Like, will not be able to be perfect. Is going to have its own limits and shortcomings, and therefore that, like, we're not going to. We're never gonna like achieve abolition, or like achieve freedom, or achieve democracy. That, like, um, these are ongoing, open-ended projects that have to remain open to contestation and critique, because they will never be perfect.
Great. Um, can I ask? So you situated us very helpfully in terms of your own your dissertation work and what you were exposed to at the in your writing your PhD and thinking about these intellectual groups that influenced you. Can you talk a little bit about how this connects with the work that you do now, like at Trinity, or how you think about it in relationship to, literally like going into these institutional spaces.
Right. Yeah. No, as you mentioned, I co-direct Trinity's prison education project. It was founded before I got to Trinity, offering, like, existing at one institution in Connecticut, the women's prison, and we've been able to expand it to the jail in Hartford. So now we're operating at these two sites, and I mean, jails are, jails mostly house unsentenced people, so folks who have been accused of a crime but not convicted, and they're detained while their criminal cases unfold, and that can take months, and that can take years. And so we think of jails as temporary. There often aren't a lot of programs. There isn't necessarily a library, but in fact, actually, these are spaces that warehouse people for a long time. So I'm very glad that at least we can offer some college classes there to offer anything at all to the folks there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I see this work as a practical intervention that I can facilitate because I am located in a university or in a college. And, therefore, I teach classes. I can recruit colleagues to teach classes. The institution will give college credit for this work. So I don't see it at all as the solution, or just but I see it as a small intervention in mass incarceration that supports incarcerated people. Like, it makes the experience of incarceration just a bit less awful, even if only because it's a distraction. Like, our classes are a distraction. Like, they offer something to do from the boredom of incarceration. It's a way also to advocate for education as something that everybody has a right to. Like, at TPEP, we frame our work not as, these are classes that will help rehabilitate fallen individuals. It's like, no, like, these are classes that are like a small practical way to support people in this experience. And they are a way to work toward a world in which anybody, regardless of where you find yourself and whether or not you've been accused of a crime, like, you have a right to learn, you have a right to education.
Yeah. So does that category of, I mean, I'm thinking about this. So in Boston, we discuss these things as well. And I teach right now sort of outside of the prisons, but with the people who are very much implicated in the system. And I have to admit, I struggle with it. I really respect and admire the people in the system that I work with, but I'm aware of, like, working in a in a system that has been set up by people who are committed to this, carceral system as it is. And so I think of these categories like non-reform, reform. I think, okay, well, there's things that, the judges, the parole officers, and I all agree on. It doesn't mean I'm abetting them. It means we're collaborating on finding something that is such a space. But I mean, do you feel like it can be argued both ways? I mean, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there is a risk that by offering college classes in carceral spaces, we're shoring up the image of carceral spaces as rehabilitative, as, like, sites of all these services that are really kind of there to help people who have been, who have made mistakes. And I think that that's a really misleading account of what the American prison system is. To focus on U.S. mass incarceration, which I know best as a scholar situated in the U.S. Like, so the U.S. is unique not only in how many people it incarcerates. Like, for many years, it had just like the single largest prison system in the world. Currently, El Salvador, because of its extreme authoritarian, like, war on drugs, like, has like a larger percentage of its population behind bars. Cuba might similarly be kind of a rival in mass incarceration at this moment. But, like, really big picture, like, the U.S. is exceptional in how many people it incarcerates. and also in how terrible prison conditions often are, like much, much worse than in comparable, highly developed
Yeah.
countries. And so to frame that as like, I think to frame it as justice, like this is criminal justice being served, or to frame it
Right.
as support or like rehabilitation, like people are getting what they need, I think it really is a gross misrepresentation of reality that, abolitionists, I think, are much more realistic in seeing what's actually going on, which is the throwing away and the warehousing of like predominantly poor people of color.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is a risk in education work then, like, yeah, shoring up this image that the system doesn't deserve. But at the same time, there's an opportunity to make a small difference in the lives of people who are currently trapped in the system. Um, and yeah, as I said, like it's an opportunity to also just to affirm a different orientation um, to the world.
Yeah. Right. And I get, and that does help. I think your paradigm of purity, apropos of that, is very helpful in terms of thinking about what it means to like keep your hands clean of that. And yeah, thank you. I mean, you stated both sides much more eloquently than I did. I appreciate that. Can I maybe ask for another? There's another term I want to get to right to comfort, and maybe we'll get there next. But like you also talked about like when we're thinking about alternatives to the extant. Yeah, it seems funny to call it a criminal justice system, but the extant carceral system. You talk about the democratic emancipatory potential of something like community accountability. But you also, really in the same breath, say you're aware that it too has its dark sides. Um, can you talk more about that? That kind of double-edged possibility of what it means to sort of look outside and beyond these sanctioned carceral systems.
Yeah, and I think feminists and abolition feminists are guides here for thinking about it, because they point out how much violence against women, how much gendered and sexual violence happens every single day in our society, and how the criminal legal system is rarely um, uh, like there to do anything about it. So like we know that, you know, only a minority of people report sexual violence to the police, and then only like a part of those actually like lead to charges, and only like some of those actually lead to a conviction. And so like
Mm.
really for the most part, um like there is gendered and sexual violence in our societies that is pervasive, that is extremely serious and extremely harmful, and that the state is just not certainly like the criminal state or like the criminal legal system is not actually effectively doing anything to stop. And so it's like from that perspective of like, okay, so we're critical of um state punishment as it exists, but we're also really concerned about interpersonal violence, for instance, gendered and sexual violence. So then, like, what do you do? And abolition feminists have thought a lot about this and have experimented with community accountability or restorative justice or transformative justice initiatives to say, like, what can we do to fight this harm? Like, what can we do to seek some kind of accountability, to hold, to confront people who've done this stuff with what they've done, to make demands on them, to try also to prevent this from happening again. So I think like that's where I see so much democratic value and potential in these efforts, because they're right that like this violence is pervasive and unacceptable. And rather than be resigned to that, of just like, oh yeah, that's just kind of how it is, nothing can be done, to take the risk of working together with other people to see what you might be able to do, um, and to develop guidelines and processes for then pursuing these kinds of efforts. So in chapter 4, I talk about a Seattle-based group called Communities Against Rape and Abuse, CARA, and they have written
We have a carceral studies reading group, and when we read your book, that was I had to miss the day, but that was I know they focused on that
Right,
chapter.
right.
So
Yeah. I mean, um, they've produced writing as many of these abolition feminist groups have done, like trying to, uh, like to theorize and share, um, what they've done, what they've learned, what has worked, what has not worked. And so I read that document as like a real effort to um to try to address harm in a like without further inflicting violence on anyone. I think their first guideline is like we need to respect the humanity of everybody involved. Like this isn't a kind of, vendetta group that like is gonna pursue violence against folks accused of wrongdoing. Like there's a real effort to think about like what a process might look like, and what they might be able to do to achieve some measure of accountability.
yeah.
So yeah, like it's not.
I take that point, but I was also struck in that chapter. You also cite Charles Tilley on like the question of like who has the monopoly on violence, and I mean it's sort of a basic, straightforward point, but it's just like we shouldn't forget that notion of the state having the monopoly on quote legitimate violence. I mean that those things seem up for debate. It doesn't. It's not a given that the state has to be the one to we have to make a decision to give the state that. Like there's an element of consent. Oh yeah, sorry. Related to that, maybe I can ask you. There's such a genealogy here. So many people. You obviously talk about Angela Davis in your work. You mentioned, Miriam Kaba, who I was thinking about on these questions as well, and also Ruth Wilson Gilmore. But can I bring in Ursula Le Guin here just briefly, if you want to comment? I've always struck by the implications of that Le Guin line. We live in capitalism and its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings. Like, in other words, that we live in an imaginative structure as much as we live in a kind of, you know, physical one. And
Yes. No, and I've been reading more sci-fi of late. I've come to the genre very, very late, and I still haven't read any Le Guin. That's clear,
oh,
in my near future.
yeah.
But
Actually, The
actually,
Dispossessed talks about prison abolition right at the get-go. Like that is one of the first scenes is basically these kids on this anarchist moon rediscovering. They reinvent the prison and they successfully reinvent it. And then they're terrified by what they've invented. I love it. It's like 4 pages, but it's brilliant. Yeah.
great. No, I look forward to reading that. It so the line that you quoted from Le Guin actually reminds me a lot of what Angela Davis does in Our Prisons Obsolete, which is to to insist. I mean, like even by raising the question, um, to to try to break the common sense of prisons, in part by reminding us of prior um, institutions and practices that seemed inevitable or like they were just never going to end, and that were successfully overthrown through collective action. So for Davis, it's racial chattel slavery, which is like, we absolutely still live in its afterlives, and nonetheless, like one form of this unfreedom, of this exploitation and this domination, was successfully ended through the Civil War. Then she talks about lynching that came after that, and of course, like Ida B. Wells and many others. Like it took a lot of work to end that practice. Um, so yeah, I recognize that invitation to really see the world as it is now, and like the oppressive systems that exist in it, um, as as potentially open to change, and also I think maybe at a more personal level, like I read it as an invitation to join the struggle of those who will try to make it obsolete, even if, we don't know the timeline, like we don't know, like no victory is guaranteed.
Yeah.
But to commit yourself to that struggle. And I think that that's one of the things, I haven't talked much about Angela Davis yet, but she's really at the core, like at the heart of the book. I associate her with agonistic abolitionism, and
I want you to associate with her with Brandeis too, because we're very proud of that genealogy where, I think her reading Marcuse there was so influential and her going to Germany eventually and, being exposed to this kind of late Frankfurt School thinking that probably.
No, it's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, we should, yes, and like Brandeis should honor her if
Yeah.
it hasn't already. If just like I would love to see, a symposium or just like that's a really valuable connection to
Agreed.
be
Yeah.
proud of.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I see Davis as, both offering a really strong critique, like a moment of no to the prison industrial complex, as she puts it, but then also as offering or like affirming a positive vision that she gets, I think, a lot of she gets a lot from working with W.E.B. Du Bois and this concept of abolition democracy, but like looking back to the abolition of slavery, and then the reorganization politically, economically, socially in the United States, to change a slave society into something approximating equal citizenship for Black and white people. She offers that as like in part to help us imagine, I think, what abolitionism might look like, or just like what to to remind us of like victories in the past that took a lot of struggle, but that were able to advance equality and freedom and democracy in a really meaningful way. Also in an incomplete way. Of course, we got Jim Crow. We got like intensified lynching. There's just like, and then like now we're in mass incarceration. So like the struggle goes on, but we can take inspiration from those people who struggled before us. And I think she invites us to take inspiration from radical reconstruction to help us think about what the kind of radical change of prison abolition might look like. That it's in part, I read her as not rejecting the state, not rejecting law. I mean, there are abolitionists who, there's a strong anarchist tradition in abolitionism, but I read Davis as a democratic socialist who sees a lot of potential in, trying to create enough popular power to change what the state does and for whom, and to use it to advance like meaningful democracy.
Yeah. Well, so we've been teasing this for a while, but maybe the point of the radical imagination allows us to connect to your right to comfort. Maybe there's radical comfort. Can we talk about that? Would you like to tell us about how you think about that? And I think it is the final chapter, right? Chapter 7 or
Yes,
chapter
chapter 5. Yes,
chapter 5. Sorry.
yeah. It's so the chapter begins with a discussion of like how abolitionists think about rights and rights claims, and like whether there's anything to be gained from them, because of course there's also such important critiques of rights discourse, as just kind of like a fig leaf over like the reality of just like vast inequality of just like, okay, so maybe on paper we have equal rights, but like in practice there's so like the racialized wealth gap and other indicators of like vast inequality. And yeah, I like, rather than conclude that rights claims will get us nowhere because they are inevitably fully going to be, I don't know, like part of the like, I don't know, part of liberalism, or like part of the status quo. I suggest that maybe emergent rights claims can help help us imagine what abolitionism might be for.
Mm-hmm.
And so an emergent rights claim is a claim that isn't yet recognized widely as like a right that we have. So it's kind of like an insurgent rights claim, maybe. And like many rights claims that we now take for granted once were emergent, right? Like the right, like women's right to vote, like that, I mean, that's actually again being called into question by some on the far right.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I suggest that the right to comfort could orient us to an abolitionist democracy. The context in which I develop it is that of extreme heat in prisons, in many prisons across the country, especially in the South, but not only. Prisons are not always air conditioned, and incarcerated people are exposed to really extremely uncomfortable, but also life threatening temperatures. And so then there's resistance to air conditioning these places out of a sense that prisons ought to be uncomfortable because kind of like some degree of physical suffering is part of the penalty that people pay, and like this is punishment. And so like you there's a desire for people to suffer, and there's a moralization of that suffering as the rendering of justice. And yeah, the right to comfort counters that. So it really proposes a different way of looking at the situation, inviting us to consider that maybe we actually have a right to be comfortable, like and maybe even incarcerated people and people convicted of crimes, do not need to suffer, and that their suffering is not part of the rendition of justice. But that perhaps all of us, incarcerated, non-incarcerated, have a right to comfort. And so on the outside, well, actually to stay within prisons, like that might also translate to affirming a right to hug, a right for like the children and loved ones of incarcerated people to hug their incarcerated loved one. There is there's so many limitations on visitation. And then especially in recent years, a move toward like online quote unquote visitations. Prison takes people away from their communities, from their loved ones, from their houses, from their jobs. And to then deprive folks of touch, like of like hugging their children or like hugging their loved one, I think we need to take really seriously. And like the right to comfort, it could be one way of thinking about like, no, we really want to affirm that right to touch.
So can I add another axis? And if you don't want to go there, it's totally fine. But I have a colleague, old friend of mine, Sharon Dolovich, who works in LA. Do you know her work? So she's worked on prisoners' rights for a long time. But her latest set of articles is about the status of correctional officers. And who, as I'm sure you know, life expectancies are very low. It's a very crummy job. There's a lot of cortisol and stress involved. And one of the things she's tackling is the problem of the prison as like a space of dehumanization, not just, as you said, where it's intended to punish people as prisoners with dehumanization, but in fact, correctional officers are themselves as well dehumanized by the nature of the work they're doing and the way we've construed it. Could that be part of that conversation as well about?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah, like I was emphasizing like incarcerated people's exposure to extreme temperatures, but like insofar as correctional officers are also in those spaces, like it affects them as well. And as you say, yeah, like I think rates of suicide and self-harm are considerable in this profession, even as it also offers, I think, like relatively like a good salary and a pension and benefits. Like it also in some ways is an attractive job in comparison to others, but then it's a tough bargain because of what.
And I think that might only be true in a universe of very limited choices. I mean, I don't want to disagree with you on the facts, but I do feel like there's a reason a lot of those prisons in New York or in upstate New York where there's not that many other economic opportunities. Like you don't see people flocking to the job if other alternatives present themselves, I think. But
right. And I mean, I see abolition as needing to provide and fight for alternatives. And so, like, incarcerated people should be not incarcerated, and those who currently, get by because of a job in the Department of Correction, like everybody else, need to have other ways of making a good living and getting the benefits that we all need and we all deserve. Yeah.
We could make this the final turn there on that note, to invite you to think about a recallable book.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much on abolition. I thought of like one really influential, a bit older, but like short and very accessible book is Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? From 2003. Really, yeah, I think like a really valuable, concise overview of like some of this thinking. For folks who are interested in like older, like thinking about alternative justice mechanisms or like alternative ways to resolve or like to respond to interpersonal harm, I would also recommend Nils Christie's essay "Conflicts as Property." So it's not a book, but it's I think from 1974 or five, and I find it a very compelling account of just like how else we like what some of the downsides are of criminal law and criminal courts as the vehicles through which to respond to harm. So I think what it does really well um is show kind of how poorly the current system um does regarding its own criteria of success. And so, Christy talks about how victims are basically completely like kept apart from like criminal proceedings, and like what the democratic costs are of outsourcing conflict resolution to lawyers and judges and just like professionals, and the kind of de-skilling that happens, and like I see that as another important reason why abolitionism is part of a democratic project. Like it invites us to think also like how we individually and with others around us, like what could we do? It's like like maybe we can do better than the state in some ways, and like let's think about that. Like let's try.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, I'm so glad you ended with 74, 75, because that allows me to end with Le Guin's. I will say another word about The Dispossessed, just to say it's called An Ambiguous Utopia. And I think it has as its spirit a line from William Morris, which is that, people fight for things and then they find out when they fought for them that they didn't get what they wanted and they have to fight for them again under different names. That like why I like speculative fiction is that it forces you to think about, those different names that things go under and the way that we're constantly reinscribing systems without thinking about it, without bringing them to mind. And then the work of fiction, and I think The Possessed does it as well as anything, is to just help bring to mind how we do actually live, not how we think we live, but how we're in fact living. So thank you so much. The one book is wonderful. I wish it all the best. It should flourish. And this conversation has been, a pleasure and a real act of generosity from you. And so thanks. And for those of you listening at home, thank you for listening. You will find related material. I think the most recent thing you will find that's related is Mark Ledney and Matthew Larson's book about ancient Mediterranean incarceration. We just spoke with them a couple of months ago, and other topics that are close to this also come up on the podcast. So have a listen. So from all of us, thanks and goodbye for now. Recall This Book is the creation of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. Sound editing is by Nawal Irfani, and music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy. We gratefully acknowledge support from Brandeis University and its Mandel Center for the Humanities. We always want to hear from you, our listeners, with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please forward it to 5 people or write a review and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.